Okay, so Thomas Jefferson. I'm going to pull up a quote, but first, this, of course, is the famous Fizz, as he was known, illustration for the storming of the Bastille. I think it's a pretty good rendition of showing the chaos and the hurrah before they meet the bullets of the guard that was in the Bastille, and you can see men and women armed. So it captures the spirit. I think it's a good illustration. But what I wanted that as a background was for this quote: "The tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. It is its natural manure." I thought this was an interesting quote to parallel the storming of the Bastille. This was written by Jefferson in 1787. At this point, of course, the revolution is over. We are figuring out our Constitution and what was going on. Jefferson was in Paris at this point as the ambassador for the U.S. And so he was around when all the stuff was beginning to percolate. Of course, 1789 is when the revolution breaks out. But Jefferson's reference here was to what became known in American history as Shays' Rebellion. And as all my former U.S. history students know, Shays' Rebellion was all about Western Massachusetts farmers who were up in arms, somewhat literally, over the high taxes that the state government was placing on them. And at the same time, rents and mortgages were going up, so their lands were being confiscated. So they decided to protest. This would help. Actually, I don't want to do a deep dive on American history here, but this would be one of the key issues that would help to create the political party system in the United States. And in the first party system, the Federalists, who would be somewhat analogous to conservatives, who wanted a strong central government, were opposed to this and saw this as a shocking example of, we've talked about this before, the mobocracy, as John Adams would have called it. And Jefferson, who would help to father the first party, Jeffersonian Republicans. Here, Republican has nothing to do with anything to do with Republicans today. Early Democrats, I guess, but totally different, because the Democrats at that time wanted states' rights. And of course, today it's just the opposite. It's the Republicans who would argue for states' rights, and the Democrats who argue for strong central government. But I deep dived. I apologize. So anyway, remember this quote, because it's going to pop up in a couple minutes again. So today's topics, we'll talk about a few of the notable moments in Dickens' life. We're covering the final 20 years, 1850 to 1870. Part one, we went to about 1852, I believe. I'll just mention his final works and put a plug in for my favorite novel. And we're going to look at one of the darker sides to the author, and then conclude with...
Kendall, I'm sorry to interrupt you. If you're running slides, they're not showing up, or at least I'm not able to see anything. Nothing's advancing. Oops. It says Thomas Jefferson, 1787.
Yeah, there's nothing after that.
Uh-oh. Well, let's stop share. Well, let's try it again. Sorry, I'm glad you said something before I went any further. I don't know what I did. And of course, now it's not even here. All right, just a minute.
The problem is we're too polite.
Well, it had to be pretty boring. He's thinking me, what the hell's he talking about? All right, I've got to get back here.
There we go.
Now,
Yeah,
so you see it now.
Now we see it. The today's topics has come up now.
Yes.
Okay. All right. So go.
Oops.
No.
Flying through back up.
Okay. Sorry about that. Notable moments of Dickens' life, his final works, darker side of the author, and his dramatic readings, which a lot of people don't really know much about. So here we go. Sorry about that, guys. So I just put this in here since you were reading about the fall of the Bastille. This is, I think, a really cool and very different illustration. It's not incomplete. This is the way Harry Furness wanted it to appear in his 1910 edition. He was, it's 1910 and the art world is changing. There's a lot of exciting things going on. And I think this is an example of it. Book illustration is actually going through a transformation. Again, I won't bore you, but I mean, even by the time of Tale of Two Cities, Dickens is wondering whether or not he really needed illustrations. They were important in his earlier serializations, and it was a reason to buy the serial pamphlets, booklets. So he experimented, and of course, with the Tale of Two Cities, it's the first time he published a novel in serial form without illustrations. If you bought the original first set, and we can talk about that in a minute. But anyway, I thought this was a cool illustration. That's all I wanted to say about that. So, Storming of the Bastille. I mean, I've gone over this, and I don't want to belabor the point, but I just thought this was interesting, and I held it back for this chapter reading. Claude Choate was a participant in the storming. He was a Parisian wine merchant. There you go again. These wine guys, troublemakers, and he also liked to draw, and he wrote an account of the storming of the Bastille. And Carlyle, who I talked about before, this was an important source for Carlyle in his research and writing that part of his book, The French Revolution, that he published, that Dickens would ultimately read. And in the book of the French Revolution, Carlyle wrote, "Blood flows, the aliment of new madness." And I juxtapose that on purpose with Jefferson's idea that the tree of liberty needs to be fed from time to time with the blood of patriots. So you can see two very different points of view. And I've said before, Carlyle, of course, very conservative in the 19th century form of that word, and very much the Old Testament, and didn't support in any way the French Revolution once it got rolling with the Reign of Terror. And Jefferson never came down as hard on even the Reign of Terror because of his attitude. So anyway, I just wanted to point that out. So Dickens, between 52 and 70, he wrote Bleak House, Hard Times, Little Dorrit, A Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations, Our Mutual Friend, and his incomplete novel, The Mystery of Edwin Drood, which was in many ways, and Ginny's better qualified to speak to this than I am. I'm not a fan of the Edwin Drood book. I think she has told me she liked it. It's a very much a psychological study in some ways. At the same time, in writing these novels, he was also publishing first Household Words, a magazine, and then All the Year Round. And in both Household Words and in All the Year Round, he was the editor. He wrote some articles, and of course, he published Tale of Two Cities in All Year Round. But there were other writers who were employed to partake in those magazines. So he was a busy guy, because also at this time, in this phase of his career, he's beginning to do his public speaking, public readings, I should say. and that was going to take up a lot of his time. So Bleak House, I personally think it's his greatest novel. If you're willing to take on a big book, this is the one to take on. It's rich, it's complex, some wonderful characters in it. It's the unless you count Edgar Allan Poe's detective, Bleak House with Inspector Bucket is really one of, if not the first, one of the earliest forms of detective fiction, because Inspector Bucket plays a key role in the novel, and it's also Dickens's expose and taking on the absurdities within English courts, and it's a wonderful book. I highly recommend it. If you don't want to read it, the most recent PBS version of Bleak House, which is about 4 parts, is available. It is well done, but it still leaves out a lot. I recommend you read the book if you're willing to take on 800 pages. So anyway, he was prolific. He wrote a lot of books, and he was the superstar of the West by the time he passed away. He was also heavily engaged in philanthropy. Here's a cut from the London Illustrated News showing him he gave a lot of speeches as fundraisers to all kinds of organizations that weren't necessarily charity organizations, although he did address those as well, but to business groups to say, okay, it's time to kick money in here for good causes. And what evolves is what literary experts today have called the Carol philosophy, reference to Christmas Carol. Quote, "Business," cried the ghost, wringing its hands again. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business." That's a quote from the first stave, Jacob Marley, bemoaning that. And it's clear that, Dickens lived by these words, and he became associated with Lady Angela Burdett Coutts, who was a wealthy heiress. She inherited what today would be worth 170 million pounds. That's a lot of money today, and that was even a lot more money back then. Charles Dickens advised her on ways to spend her money, and she did give a lot of it away. Probably their most famous project, and this was in Dickens Part 1, was the construction of Urania Cottage, which was to get single women off the streets from their prostitution, and get them training and being able to stand self-sufficient on their own feet. So philanthropy was an important sidebar for Dickens, and he did well with it. He and Catherine sired a lot of children, as you can see here. Catherine was pregnant for much of her married life, at least the first half of it, and this array of children. The first 2 or first 3 are probably the most famous. Charlie ended up as a writer after failing at business and did a lot of editing for his dad in his magazines. Mary was also a writer and was published. Kate, or Catherine, was the one child out of all of them who sided with her mother on the split that would occur, and we'll hear about in a minute. 2 went into the military. 1 moved to Australia, and probably the most successful of them all was Henry Fielding, 3rd from the bottom. He was a very successful, prominent lawyer who stood before the bar and won a lot of significant cases and did a lot of legal writing for that. So a lot of kids. Poor Catherine. Speaking of poor Catherine, Jenny.
As I say, speaking of poor Catherine, she did have 10 children in 15 years and several miscarriages before that. So Dickens' life was basically almost as exciting as his novels. He was having problems with his marriage and not getting along, and he was putting on a production for charity. As Kendall just mentioned, he was actually doing a fundraiser for a family, and he was doing the play The Frozen Deep. And he had been casting it, his daughters were playing parts in it. And he wanted a professional cast to raise more money so he could help this family out that needed money. He raised actually, I think, like £7,000 on this play. So a friend of his recommended the Turnins, Mrs. Turnin and her two daughters, Maria and Ellen, to be in The Frozen Deep and replace his daughters. At the time, Ellen Turnin was 18 years old and Dickens was 45. He became obsessed with her. She was all he could think about. If you read Great Expectations and know anything of that story, Pip is obsessed with Estella, and this is written while he was so enamored with her, and a lot of people feel that relationship is how he felt about Ellen. So now his shaky marriage does start to fall apart. And down here I have a quote here from a letter written, oh no, I'm sorry, on my other page here. Just a second, sorry. Doop, 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 doop. What happened here? Hold on. Well, anyway, so his marriage starts to fall apart. And of course, he has his quote here about his relationship with her, where he says, "I wish an ogre with 7 heads and no particular evidence of a brain in the whole of them had taken the princess whom I adore. You have no idea how intensely I love her, to his stronghold at the top of a high Ceres mountains, and then tied her up by her hair. Nothing would suit me half so well this day as climbing after her, sword in hand, and either winning her or being killed." That's a frame of mind for you in 1857. And he wrote that letter to the Coots, and Coots, the woman who he did a lot of charity work with, he had sent that to her. So he's crazy about her. There's nothing going on between them at this time other than he's just crazy about her. She lives with her parents. They're doing the play. He's met her. He's stricken with her. Nothing is really happening. Okay. So now as we go to the next slide here, Dickens' marriage is falling apart. It sort of becomes the Real Housewives of Gad's Hill, because you've got Catherine, his wife. You've got Katie, the daughter that sides with Catherine, the wife. You've got Georgina, who is Catherine, his wife's sister, who lives with Dickens and raises their children. She sides with Dickens. You've got Mrs. Hogarth, Catherine's mother, who hates Dickens and is doing everything she can to trash him, along with her younger sister, Helen. And then you've got Ellen, who everybody's talking about. So Dickens, in a quote from Dickens here from another letter he wrote, that no two people were ever created with such an impossibility of interest, sympathy, confidence, sentiment, tender union of any kind between them as there is between my wife and me. They are not getting along, and this is how he feels. So in the classic, this could only happen in a movie, Dickens thinks he needs to order Ellen a bracelet, and the jeweler, by mistake, delivers it to Catherine's house where she is. And of course, she sees it and opens it and is like, what? Now, he was known for giving gifts to actresses in his productions, but this was not something she was about to stand for. So it turns into a big battle now. So Mrs. Hogarth, Catherine, Helen, and Katie on one side, and then you got Georgina and Dickens on the other. There are all kinds of things said. They are casting aspersions upon Dickens having an affair with her. He swears nothing's going on. And sadly, letters get published in the newspaper, and letters actually saying that Catherine has mental health issues and, never cared for her children. I mean, Dickens actually wrote in a letter that, she never once cared about any of her children, and her children never cared about her, and that Georgina did everything in raising the children. And so then Dickens was furious with Mrs. Hogarth and the things they were saying. So he made them print a retraction in the paper. He printed an article in the paper himself where he said, this is just a horrible thing, and we're impugning, they never mention Ellen's name, but we're impugning this lovely, wonderful person. And it's just awful. It's all over the place. And Dickens is very, very worried this is going to affect his popularity as a writer, all of this mess. And so he's busy denying anything is going on between them of a sexual nature, basically, that there is just, nothing to it. Anyway, it all reaches a head. And of course, Catherine, they finally separate. And so Catherine is set up in a separate house and is now away from Dickens and able to move on from there. Okay, so if we move on to the next slide there, I think is the next thing. So as a result of this, Dickens took all the Turnins, Mrs. Turnin and Maria and Ellen, all under his protection. He set them up in a house. He paid for them. He got the other sister, Maria, acting lessons. He helped the mother with things. He was doing all kinds of things for them. But they tried to keep their relationship hidden from the world as best as possible. In a quote from Edmund Yates, who was a good friend of Dickens, he said that my lips are sealed and my tongue is paralyzed as regards the circumstances, which if I felt less responsibility and delicacy, I might be at liberty to state. In the room, there were rumors that they had a child and it died. There's no proof of that. There were lots of rumors going around. They were never able, of course, to marry. She was often at Gad's Hill. He was often visiting her. On the left there, you can see a picture of the two of them together. There is reason to believe that Dickens won Ellen against her will, wearing down her resistance by the sheer force of his desperate determination. A minister, a canon, that she spoke to herself said, I had it from her own lips that she loathed the very thought of intimacy. So this was later in her life. She did go on to marry. And the strange part with Dickens was he went all this trouble to keep things quiet, not have them seen together, not be out in public, not letting anybody talk about them. Then he went ahead and wrote his will and left her £1,000, which is really not a huge sum considering. But then when he died, everybody knew that she'd left £1,000, and that caused the scandal to revive again. So all this is going on in Dickens' life. He is trying to keep working, writing books. He needs to keep moving. He needs to keep earning money because he's supporting everybody under the sun, his 10 children, the Turnins, other relatives. So he decides with all this to go to America, that he is going to make a second tour to America. So if we go to the next one, I think there is his second tour of America. So he decides he's going to go back. He didn't really want to go. But he's going to go. And actually, before I sort of talk about some of this, he did want to invite Ellen. He thought she could go to America with him. So he sent her a code and he said, to see if it would work or not, he said, he'll send a message. And he says, all well, that means she's to come to America. If she sends and says safe and well, don't come. And of course, she did get the safe and well message. So she didn't come to America. But he says, which is interesting, tied in, he said, I begin to feel myself drawn towards America as Darnay in A Tale of Two Cities was attracted to the lodestone rock, Paris. And so he goes off to America to do this many city tour on the East Coast. And he is a rock star. He is like the Taylor Swift, Bruce Springsteen of America. He has sold out everywhere. Tickets that were sold for $2 each were being scalped for $26. They actually limited ticket sales to 6 per person to try to limit scalping. So then the guys who were into scalping were putting caps on the first 20 people that were working for people to get tickets. They tried to say then they wouldn't sell to people who were wearing caps. His manager was doing everything to try to stop all this scalping with little success. People actually was quite the joke. People slept overnight on the streets to line up for the tickets. Restaurants actually served them breakfast on the sidewalk. It was just unbelievable how popular he was. His dramatic acting of all these different scenes that he would do had people mesmerized. Great quote from his biography that I read. One entire family came over from Brooklyn by ferry in a blinding snowstorm. On such a night, some astonished friends said they would not have come from Brooklyn to see the Apostle Paul. No, neither would we, was the reply, but we came to hear Dickens. What a great quote. And when he went to Washington, President Johnson had a whole row for every reading of the week while he was there. He took a whole row and was there every night. And it was interesting later on, as Johnson was impeached, he was in another city and actually affected some of his ticket sales and people coming because the country was in sort of such an uproar about that. It affected him a little bit during part of his tour. But he gave amazing performances and people were mesmerized by him. and it took a physical toll on him. I'll talk a little bit about that, I think, the next time, how it affected him. But he was very popular. He made a ton of money on this tour, way more than he even expected to make. He was really, really popular. And of course, this got him away from the scandal as well. You know, out and about and having people think great things about him. And that way Ellen sort of stayed home and out of the background.
Hey, Ginny?
Yes.
So a little footnote to that, the Frozen Deep was written by Wilkie Collins, who was a great,
Yes.
I think the best mystery writer of the 19th century, The Woman in White. It was his great novel. But anyway, Dickens was inspired by that play, as he was almost inspired by it to start thinking about The Tale of Two Cities. And of course, Ellen Ternan was acting there in that play. And so I've read a few accounts where people will say, well, actually, because he was writing A Tale of Two Cities after that production, Lucy is kind of a, you know, and a kind of an interpretation of Ellen.
Yeah, they talked a bit about Lucy being more like Mary Hogarth, and but also possibly Ellen as well. But I know from what I read, a lot of people really felt that Estella was sort of the torturing him kind of relationship, because he couldn't, you know, he was kept apart from her for most of his life.
Thanks, Jenny. So as Jenny said, Dickens is a rock star, not only because of his novels themselves, but also because of the performances that he began to take on. There's a story that's is legendary. There is some facts to support it, but some Dickensians question it. But it's a good story regardless. As you know, he serialized all his novels. So he was writing Old Curiosity Shop, if you have ever read it. And there is one of Dickens's favorite beloved characters in there, Little Nell. And Little Nell is sick and perhaps dying. And as he wrote these serializations like a soap opera, he leaves you wondering whether she's going to die or not. And so the next ship arrives in New York City Harbor with the load of printed copies of the next piece for Dickens, and there's people waiting on the dock yelling at the stevedores, "Is Little Nell alive?" It's a good story, whether or not it's true, but it illustrates how popular he really was. I remind you, from those who attended Dickens 1, Dickens really wanted to be an actor first and foremost, but it carried a lot of baggage because a lot of people in the 1830s, when he's setting out, really looked down on actors. And plus, your potential for making money wasn't as great as if you were a successful writer. So he kind of reluctantly gave up the idea of acting professionally, although he did act throughout his adult life in amateur productions. And there's actually a lot written about that. But he really comes into his own with these public readings. And the public readings are kind of like his greatest hits. He would pull out excerpts, usually 2 or 3 for the entire 2 hours-ish. And people went wild. He started it in 1853, and for the first 5 years, he did it just for free to raise money for charities and causes. But in 1858, he decided that he wanted to make more money, even though by 1858 he is really making a lot of money. And as Ginny was talking about the second trip to America, in that trip alone, he earned £3 million just for those months he was overseas. That's a lot of money, and that was just for one trip. And of course, he had gone before, but it wasn't quite as wildly popular the first time around, although it was popular. From 1858 on, he charged, and it went into his own pocket, which really fattened his wallet. He was wildly successful. It did take a toll on his health, which we'll talk about in our last session. This is from Edgar Johnson's biography, which Jenny just mentioned she read, on public readings. Quote, "It was more than a reading. It was an extraordinary exhibition of acting, without a single prop or bit of costume, by changes of voice, by gesture, by vocal expression. Dickens peopled his stage with a throng of characters." The number one hit was Christmas Carol. People wanted that more than any other. Second would have been Mrs. Bardell, the court scene with Mrs. Bardell, which is in Pickwick papers, or here, as you see in the newspaper, a trial for Pickwick.
He also was a huge hit with The Death of Nancy, when he decided to do From Oliver Twist. In The Death of Nancy, he actually had women fainting in the audience when he acted that whole thing out. People would pass out, and all his friends told him not to do it, but he was totally into it and committed.
Yeah. As Jenny mentioned, standing room only. This is an engraving that's considered to be pretty accurate for what his stage presence looked like. Screen was always set up behind him for a shadow effect, but that's all. And he had his desk, which he traveled brought with him from England, and is on display in the Dickens House Museum, the original, to this day. It's quite a treasured piece. Here's two reviews from his American performance. "It took time for the audience to settle, but then Dickens, to an accompaniment of loud cheers and applause and waving of handkerchiefs, walked briskly onto the platform in his evening tailcoat with its lapels faced in satin and with two small red and white flowers in his buttonhole. The set was unchanged. The same maroon backcloth, the same maroon carpet, the desk and the array of gas pipes. Without acknowledging the applause in any way, he began to read from A Christmas Carol." And another source: "The second advent of Mr. Dickens in this country has been accompanied by even greater demonstrations of delight and affection than greeted him on his first arrival. The desire to hear his readings is manifested among all classes, and nearly 10,000 tickets were sold for the short course of readings in Boston." Boston was Dickens's favorite city from both of his trips, he said. So this is a cartoon that was published in American papers when Dickens said farewell to the United States and was leaving. And I just think it's a wonderful illustration. Here's Dickens having his hand shaken, and behind him are some of Dickens' most notable characters, such as Mr. Pickwick, etc. So I just think that's a nice way to sign off on his public readings. It was a huge part of his life and his profession, and he was a true star with it. So he would have been a good actor, probably. Okay, Doc.
This is an illustration from 1867, and I have to say that I'm pretty embarrassed because I have not looked up the way you pronounce this guy's name. So I'm going to call him Saul Eiting.
Sounds good.
Yeah, but I hate that. I didn't look it up. Anyway, it's on page 232, and the illustration, the quote is on page 232, but the illustration is sort of a generalized illustration. He didn't make the illustration to relate to a particular passage, but anyway, so I chose a passage. "Instantly, Madame Defarge's knife was in her girdle. The drum was beating in the streets, as if it and a drummer had flown together by magic, and the vengeance uttering terrific shrieks and flinging her arms about her like all the 40 Furies at once, was tearing from house to house, rousing the women. This picture just really, just is striking to me. What do you see in it that try to guess why I chose this, given what you know of The Vengeance?
How about that chin?
You want to say more about the chin?
I'd say it's a strong chin, to say the least.
It is a strong chin. Okay. What else?
The face has determination with the frowning brows, but the evil smile on her face.
I know that. Yeah, that's a freaky smile. Keep going.
I think she's got a somewhat masculine look about her
Oh, okay. Where do you see that?
in her arms.
Oh my God. I know. I would be really scared.
And the neck, too,
And
quite thick.
very thick neck. Yes. Yes. What else do you see in the picture?
I was gonna
We
say,
got the whole. I'm sorry. Go.
I was gonna comment about how in the background everyone kind of blends together, and the Vengeance is the only person that you can really see in the mob, almost like representative of the entire thing.
Okay, that's really good. So, what else can you say about the folks in the background?
They're all male.
Ah, okay. So,
She's
So
not-
could this have something to do with the Statue of Liberty? I mean, that was dedicated to the United States in the late, I think it was 1888, 67, 68, something like that. And that's also a rather manly looking woman.
wow. I don't know. I have no idea. But
But Lady Liberty, Lady Vengeance.
yeah, well, I mean, when you have Madame Defarge and Lady Vengeance, I mean, you're dealing. One of the questions that I asked was about the mythic. I mean, she's not a, she's one of the Eumenides. She's an Amazon. She's a virago. She's scary. And it also kind of emphasized to me how, among the men, it is these women, and that's so shocking to Dickens, right? I mean, he says it time and time again. And actually, in that passage from which this is taken, he further writes, "The men were terrible in the bloody-minded anger with which they looked from the windows, caught up what arms they had, and came pouring down into the streets. But the women were a sight to chill the boldest." And I think that really is encapsulated in that illustration. We'll talk more about the women.
There's also a certain amount of glee of joy in her face.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good point, Richard.
I also think you keep calling her Lady Vengeance, but I think maybe purposefully he just called her the Vengeance in the book, like not really here nor there, sort of just like this kind of nondescript entity.
Yeah, and you also don't know much about her husband other than he's a poor, impoverished grocer, right? I mean, he's almost ignored.
Probably a lot of the men in Saint Antoine felt like that they were unable to provide for their family, and they had nothing to eat, so they were weakened. And so the women took charge. Mrs. Defarge actually ran the whole thing, in my opinion. She decided when the mob was going to happen and it was going to attack. So everyone was just waiting for her signal.
Yeah.
Okay, Peter?
I'm fine, yeah.
Okay, so I'm back to my two good friends, Pross and Cruncher. And as they come to Paris, I think you're going to see more and more both of them sort of representing England in Paris. When Laurie gets there, he says, of course, the Vengeance and Madame Defarge come there, and he says, "Our good Pross Defarge is an English lady and knows no French." And then she says she also bestowed a British cough on Madame Defarge. I love that, a good British cough on that woman. She has nothing. I think she believes she called the vengeance, "You bold face, you." Hello, bold face. But Prost does the shopping and bargaining without ever speaking a word of that nonsense, as she calls it. She's lived in Paris for a year and will not learn one word of this language, but she makes herself understood, and she gets a bargain. And they talk about how whatever number she holds up, the storekeeper holds up, she holds up one less and gets what she wants. And of course, important and critical to the plot, in the course of her shopping in the wine shop, she encounters her brother Solomon, the wonderful brother Solomon, who can do no wrong, who should have married the ladybird, of course, who took all her money and ran off with it. And who is her brother Solomon other than John Barsad, the spy? And this will become critical because, of course, she recognizes him. He is very upset about it because he wants no part of her recognizing him, because he is a British citizen in France as a spy. And as Madame Defarge already knows, he's a spy. But this really starts to drive the plot forward, her recognizing him while she is with Cruncher. And so as a result of this encounter, Sidney Carton appears in the middle of it and says, "Let's get the good Miss Pross home." And when she walks home with him, I think this is a really important foreshadowing coming along. She said, "There was a braced purpose in the arm and a kind of inspiration in the eyes, which not only contradicted his light manner, but changed and raised the man." And she said she would remember this the rest of her life, when he took her arm to walk her home that night, while Cruncher took her brother to meet Mr. Laurie. So I think this is becoming important. I think you're going to see that as we reach a conclusion, Pross becomes very important as a character, but also I think in representing England. Now, the next slide, Cruncher, of course, is off to Paris with her and working there. And I love how Laurie, when he first says, "Who's going with you to Paris? You're going by yourself?" Like, I can't believe they're sending this 80-year-old guy, or he's 78, off to Paris to sort things out during the Reign of Terror. And so, who's going with you? And he says, "Laurie, nobody will expect Jerry of being anything but an English bulldog, or having any design in his head but to fly at anybody who touches his master." So he's going to take him with him to get him going. Jerry joins Lucy and Pross as a figure to fill a doorway that would bear considerable knocking on the head. So this is the guy you want with you to protect you while you're in Paris and things are going crazy. And of course, Pross and Cruncher are together doing the shopping when they meet Solomon Pross. And then this picture here, the game made, this is from the House of Cards chapter, where Sidney Carton is presenting the cards. And you can see second from the right is Cruncher with his spiky hair sticking straight up as he listens to them talking, as Sidney Carton is presenting his cards to John Barsad. And of course, Cruncher knows that Barsad is a spy, and he recognizes that. Actually, Sidney's the one who says, what his name is, and gets together with him. And then Cruncher reveals a very critical thing. When they think all the cards have been played, he reveals that Roger Cly, his good friend from the very beginning of the novel, was not in the coffin. "I tell you that you buried paving stones and earth in that there coffin. Don't go and tell me you buried Roger Cly." And that, of course, becomes an important thing, because he knows that Roger Cly was never in that coffin. And of course, that might reveal to other people as we go along what his trade might have been, other than being a messenger for Tellson's. So things are getting, I think, important for Pross and Cruncher as we move towards the end of the novel.
I love how his spiky hair is exaggerated in the shadow.
Yeah, it's a great.
Yeah.
That's a
I know.
great technique.
It's great. That's a great picture.
Following our theme of female revolutionaries. Questions?
Excellent. Well, I'll ask a question which kind of relates back to the slide, and that is, I get it. I get that, that certainly the women did have to take charge in that, in that society during the revolution. But my question is, what does Dickens achieve by creating both the vengeance end Madame Defarge in the way that he does. And part of this is that I'm wondering whether they're simply sort of the villainesses, the one-dimensional characters, or is there more to it? And why does he spend so much time talking about the violence of women? What are your thoughts about that?
How about equality?
I think he's a bit of a chauvinist, personally.
Keep going.
I think the vengeance is there to support Madame Defarge in her bloodthirstiness, to sort of be a character. Because as you know, Monsieur Defarge is all for the revolution, but he's not quite as bloodthirsty as Madame Defarge. He's not looking, to wipe out everybody necessarily. And so I think the vengeance is sort of like her cheering squad that, whatever she says, kill them all, everybody's got to go, write everybody in my scarf. The vengeance is right there saying, yeah, you're right, let's do it. And I think the women, as I spoke about whatever 2 times ago, they were very involved in the revolution, and a lot of them were bloodthirsty and wanted to be carrying arms. They were the ones that were starving. Their children were starving, and they could not get bread or food, and they couldn't produce milk to feed their babies because they had no food. So they were pretty angry and driven, and I think the vengeance of Madame Defarge sort of fulfill those roles of representing the women who were so angry during the revolution.
Mrs. Defarge was the visionary and the strategist person, the tactician. And although she carried out the execution and led it, as Ginny said, that the vengeance was the cheering squad that got all these women all full of bloodlust and descending into madness. And I don't think Madame Defarge was ever mad. She was too calculating. From an early age, she had one goal in life: to take her revenge on the aristocracy. And she just followed that along. But I don't think any of the other women could really relate to that. So the vengeance, who they all knew was a fellow wife and mother in their community, was there to pull them all together and show that this was a good thing. And it turned out to be, everything worked out fine from their point of view.
Mm-hmm. And yet some of the most violent moments, like, that page from like 228 to the end of chapter 21 it's like a potpourri of violence. And she's the one who hewed off the head of that guard. And Dickens gives a lot of detail to the specific acts of violence that the women commit. And I wonder, I wonder, yes, there's the historical element, of course. Women were driven to violence, but it seems really to surprise Dickens, doesn't it? And I wonder why he seems surprised.
I'm not adding to that, but I just want to say, I just hear the orchestra building every time he writes about this.
I know.
She's knitting. My heart starts pounding. He does such a beautiful job, and I'm waiting for the orchestra to come in and sound the drums and the cymbals. Yeah.
I think building on what Ginny had covered about his relationship with his wife and his sort of worship of this 18-year-old angel of the house character, I feel like you can see some of that. If he was indeed writing Tale of Two Cities at that time, you can see some of that. Women of a certain age who are married become violent and turbulent and castrators of men. And women of a certain age, like Lucy, become angels and perfect ones. And, I just started next week's reading, but, Carton's going to capitalize she like she's some sort of deity. And I feel like there's a sort of saccharine worship of Lucy and a detestation of Madame Defarge, who I find fascinating, but maybe that's my perversity. I just find her really interesting in a way that I don't find Lucy as interesting. And I wonder if that's some of his own animosity towards his own wife.
Well, it might be
Say,
something.
looking at that one picture, the vengeance could look a little bit like, Catherine, and she was certainly, he didn't have anything good to say about her. Not that he was easy to live with either, but he didn't have a lot good to say. But she was sort of heavy and big, like the vengeance.
I think Dickens wanted to convey the full horror of women participating in this, because you're used to thinking about wars being a man's job where the women are at home with the children. So maybe this was so shocking to a lot of the people who were reading this for the first time, that women were like that. And it was so vivid. I felt like I was holding an axe in one hand and a dagger in another. And this contrast with the earlier chapters back in England, where everything was so atmospheric and dreamy, when they're thinking about footsteps, or that very strange passage about the dead son, which I couldn't figure out anything, why that was there, what point it served. It just seemed out of place.
Well, it's a little scary to. Go ahead.
I wanted to ask just
space. Sorry.
I just wanted to throw in the dance. He seems to be particularly horrified by this dancing in the streets.
Yes.
Even more so than the bloodshed almost. I think this is the height of
It's on like 288. Is that what you're talking
Right. The Carmagnole is like another mob scene. And I think Dickens is always frightened of a mob, and that dancing is almost mob-like. They grab everybody. But in every scene where there's a mob, you can tell that he's nervous about that.
Yeah, that's one of those tableau vivants, where, everything is focused on action. Nobody speaks. There's no dialogue whatsoever in that. And it's just, it's scary. It's scary. There's just no control. That's you see there.
Typical of all mobs, whether that be from the 19th century or the 21st century.
Hasn't changed a lot. Does anybody, I'd be curious if anybody else thought Holly mentioned that, and I think I mentioned that too in my questions. I wasn't sure what the point was of mentioning that they had a son who passed away with his blonde curls laying all around the pillow and said, Mom and Dad, I'm sorry to be leaving you. And it was just a very brief moment passing through of sort of the passage of time, that obviously it had another child and they had come and gone, but I wasn't sure what Dickens was trying to tell us with that, other than I know he lost children, during his lifetime as well.
I was just reading back on that because I completely just did not even notice that at all.
Yeah, you can go right by it.
Yeah, and it's in that echoing footsteps part, and I think they're in London or England at that point.
Yeah.
And just comparing to like London to Paris, and Paris is so violent and horrible. And he says, Lucy heard in the echoes of years none but friendly and soothing sound. So like even the echoes and that horrible, loss of a child, even those echoes like weren't horrible. We're in London and it's okay here. Like even those echoes are friendly.
Plus,
is it maybe Dickens? Is it maybe him just trying to make us feel sorry for Lucy? Like tragedy does actually touch Lucy at some point in the book, and maybe he just throws it in super quick to say that not everybody in this book is untouched, even Lucy. That maybe it's a call for sympathy in the later part of the book.
Yeah, but Lucy can do no wrong. I mean, maybe he threw it in there so Carton would get a mention, because the kid says, "Poor Carton, kiss him for me." I mean, the sentimentality of that scene just goes over. I mean, it's almost vomitous to me.
But it's also complicated. If Darnay has a son, then the Marquis d'Evremont has an heir,
yes,
right? And so, I mean, in many ways, because of male lines being the only ones that can inherit, he's the last of that generation. So he's the only one who's dealing with what he's dealing with in Paris right now. It's not going to be visited on his offspring in the same way because his offspring is female.
Excellent. Other ideas, or do you want to move to another topic?
I just have a question. It's maybe more of a Kendall question. How much of what we're seeing of this revolution is Dickensian and through his sort of particular lens versus, I mean, are there any accounts of the revolution that are hopeful and patriotic and inspired, or is it just a horror show from everybody's point of view?
No, excellent question. There are plenty of primary sources, and during the Reign of Terror, the most radical group, the Montagnards, the Mountain, left behind all kinds of written pieces that are very hopeful, that this is the future. We're going to rid ourselves of all the bad, and the sun is rising, not setting. But that's the radical view. For the middle class and the aristocracy and the church and royalty, of course, it's a horror show. In general terms, I mean, you can't separate the two. It's Carlyle and Dickens in this novel, because Dickens relied heavily on Carlyle's initial research. So it's an accurate presentation. I said last time you can't separate class from anything in Europe at this point in time, and England as well. And this certainly is a class-oriented presentation in his novel. And there are members of the English working class who would have sympathized with the mob, just not willing, for the most part, to pick up the pitchforks and the axes, as I talked last time about the Chartists and all that. So,
Kendall, if I may, there's I find that I'm reminded of Conrad's The Horror of the Horror when I read about the French citizens, because only in the rarest moments do we get anything really sympathetic. Like on 235. Now, this is after Foulon's head is put on a pike, but anyway. Scanty and sufficient suppers those, and innocent of meat, as of most other sauce to wretched bread. Yet human fellowship infused some nourishment into the flinty viands, and struck some sparks of cheerfulness out of them. Fathers and mothers who had had their full share in the worst of the day, played gently with their meager children, and lovers, with such a world around them, and before them, loved and hoped. That really, struck me, because there aren't that many moments where, after all of the horrors that were perpetrated, by the citizens, that you really, all of a sudden, you come to this moment where, hey, these are just people. These are just people. They've been driven to certain extents. And I guess what I'm saying is that most of the time, it's the horror of the horror.
And let me just throw out one name, Karl Marx. He's written his piece in 1848. So this is 10 years later. So there's an audience out there for the radicals.
Yeah. But Dickens does not speak.
Oh, no, not at all.
Yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Of course.
I know that Charles Dickens is not classically considered a feminist, but is this a feminist novel?
Ooh, that's a good.
That's a great question.
Because
Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No. Go ahead.
Because you see, I think in Lucy, the traditional idea of a woman at this time, a mother and caring and compassionate. She sees the good in everyone. And then you see Defarge, who's, you know, very much driving the revolution and blood hungry and vengeful and working through power structures her own way in, I think, a very, you know, traditionally masculine way. And it's very striking to me that at this time, you know, they're serving as counterparts of what is a woman. I was wondering if other people had views on that.
So that's a good point, Mr. Mattern. You need to date check us, because that's a good point. So if you go back to Battle Cry for Freedom on the Civil War, and they talk about the revolution and the changing roles of women, that's a good point. Like, did Dickens tour and seeing some of these societal changes in the US, is all that sort of cross hybridizing kind of thing? I don't know. You know what I'm saying?
I mean, I think for me, what is
yeah.
critical is not just whether or not he shows women occupying traditionally masculine roles, but how they're portrayed as a result of having occupied those roles. I love Madame Defarge. I think she's fascinating, but I have a tendency to read against the grain of what authors intend. I teach The Wife of Bath as a feminist text, which was clearly not Chaucer's intention. So I just think it's very interesting to see the ways in which she is made into, as Peter said, a horror. I think she is portrayed as this vengeful demon. I think that image that you showed us of the vengeance is deliberately masculinized to make her horrifying. So while we may, from our current modern vantage, read that and say, this is fascinating, and she's pushing back against all sorts of inequitable power structures, and her husband defers to her, and she's the one who decides whether or not people can go. She's clearly not the heroine of the story, the way that Lucy is the great hope. Her name literally means light. You know, so I feel like she is held up as the pinnacle of what women are supposed to be, and Defarge is some sort of hideous anomaly. If we're reading it through Dickens' intent rather than through my modern lens.
I also think Pross is very much somebody who stands up for things. If you remember her description in the very beginning when she threw Laurie across the room and he said, I thought it was a man, you know, that decked me when, you know, he upset Ladybird, but she very much holds her ground against everybody. She's not intimidated by Madame Defarge and the Vengeance when they come in. She gets right in their face. She refuses to speak French and to do anything with them. I think she's a very strong character for women, that, you know, she stands up and is a staunch defender of Ladybird and her family, just as Madame Defarge stands up, you know, for what she believes in, but she's not very namby-pamby at all. She's not afraid to say what she thinks, and, you know, and she, you know, browbeats poor Laurie around when she talks to him, you know, and Jerry Cruncher. She's not afraid to push men around.
She's not, but she uses her power to support the ideal woman.
Yeah. Yes.
You know, it's all about the promotion and the support of Lucy.
And she's
and
a
therefore
servant.
She's neutralized as scary. She's also a little bit ridiculous in her constant, like,
comical.
oh, she should marry Solomon. So I think whatever
She's
power
got some
she
comic
has,
relief going.
I think diffused by comedy. I agree with you.
Yeah, she's definitely comic relief, but she also does show, you know, some characteristics to be able to stand up.
She does, but you know, her position is that as a servant.
Right, she is a servant.
Which I think that, you know, is also undercuts some of that. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And Defarge means of the blacksmith.
Look at you. And so
I
go
just
ahead.
looked it up. I just looked it up. I didn't just.
No, I knew you did, but anyway.
Any other questions?
I know Kendall's looking at the clock because he got first pitch coming up here in like 20 seconds. But what I would say is
I truly was not. So
in this section, to me, I don't know, aside from the chauvinism, feminism type thing, and just in general, to me, there's kind of a Shakespearean flair to how this goes, especially when the Pross's brother becomes the, you know, turns out to be a spy. To me, those are all twists that, like, I hadn't really come across before as far as Dickens went. But in this particular case, for some reason, I was like, this has that kind of Shakespearean twist to it. Just an observation.
Good observation. Derek, I'm sorry. This is non-Dickensian, but what is that hat?
I
Oh,
know.
I wanted you to ask so bad too. So the minor league puts on this thing called Copa de la Diversión, which is embracing Hispanic culture in the minor league teams.
Yeah.
So this is the Myrtle Beach Pelicans.
Cool.
And then it's done in these vibrant, this is like the culture of.
Really, it's beautiful.
Yes, thank you. I'm
Excellent.
glad you asked. I love it.
And
Derek, it's
Derek,
not
you wear it
associated-
so well. You wear it so well.
It's not associated with the pro team, obviously.
I'm sorry.
It's not associated with the pro team.
No, they only do this in the minor leagues.
Okay.
So
Anyone else?
I think it's best that we close here since I really need to get the TV on. And
yeah, Corbin's on first, by the
Well,
way.
I
just
think
so you know.
McCurdy.
Schwarber could have already hit a home run.
No, he did not. He did not. Corbin's on first. Nola's
Okay.
giving up a hit.
Ooh.
well, one thing I'd like to say, Kendall, next week, why don't you guys come up with questions? You know, we're pushing you with our questions. Why don't you come up with the questions and you sort of take charge? That sound good? Okay, with the lack of response, we'll still make up some
Yeah, I
questions.
was going to say,
How do you see that working? Do
Sounds
we
good.
email you questions by a certain
No,
point?
you don't even have to email me.
Oh,
just
so you're
ask the
just going to
question.
turn it over to us to ask questions?
Well, I mean, I'm not going to totally just give you total freedom, but yeah, generally.
Just
Well,
like
that'd be
what's the reading for next time?
The end.
The reading is the rest of the novel.
Yeah, to the end.
This
We'll
next
have
week
it be a
is our
true-
final chapter.
It'll be a
It's,
true GA
book
roundtable.
3, 9 to 15.
That's right. There you go.
Yeah.
Book
Yeah.
Book
Just
3, 9 to
roundtable.
15 is the end.
Just think of us as at the Harkness table next week, okay?
we'll still do a little intro. I have to celebrate Halloween next week, so there's a Dickens
That's right,
Halloween
yeah,
connection.
yeah.
So, oh, shut up, Doc. And Doc and I will have a special exhibition as well.
That's what I was going to mention.
Yeah, but that's all.
You're
we'll
going
say
to be in
about that.
scary costumes, right?
Well, we always are, but and on that note, I think we'll say thank you very much for joining, and we'll see you all next week.
Thank
Go
you.
Phil.
Good night, everybody. Thanks.
Good night.
Phillies. Everybody.
Thanks for coming.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Heather.
Hey, Doc, would you stay on for a second? And Kendall, you too, if you
Of
want.
course, of course.
Sure.
You didn't get to, I was going to really shine with.
My God, why don't you just come out and like just interrupt? Because I feel bad. You're looking
I
for
should.
that table slap.
No, this one might not, but I will say.
Your
but
emails to me. I mean,
Doc, shut up. Let him talk.
no, that's fine. You asked about how Madame Defarge and the Vengeance become mythical, and then one of the questions was, who is it? And like Lee, I looked something up, so I can't take full credit for it, but I did do some research, and I'm not sure how you pronounce it, but the Moray or the Fates.
yes.
And so interestingly enough, one of the sisters used a length of yarn
Yes.
and would cut it. And then Madame Defarge knits. And then that's where she gets the names to kill. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Obviously, I would say directly connected. So
And at one point in tonight's reading, they're referred to as fates.
Yeah.
40 fates. Yeah, but certainly that idea of everybody's name is being woven in, and she's going to decide when to cut the thread.
And that's a big piece in mythology, German mythology, the Norns and all that weaving and all that. So he borrowed that one. So, all right, gang. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
Take care, everybody.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Go Phils.
Yeah.
Go Phils.